Your brain works like a living garden. Instead of sunlight and rain, it depends on closeness and connection to thrive. In 2025, the World Health Organization reports that roughly 1 in 6 people worldwide struggle with loneliness, and US polls show nearly 30% of adults feel it weekly. That means huge numbers of brains are left running on drought. When intimacy is scarce, the brain's oxytocin-based bonding responses dip while stress hormones like cortisol remain elevated. Over time, it even starts rewiring itself to expect rejection. Have you ever felt safer alone than reaching out? Type me in the comments if so. So what does that shift really do to the mind? And why can a single hug sometimes stabilize us better than any self-care app? The chemistry of connection. The chemistry behind these experiences is where things get especially revealing. Every time you reach for closeness, your brain doesn't just respond emotionally, it launches a biochemical sequence that shapes how safe and supported you feel. Researchers call this dynamic the chemistry of connection. When touch occurs, like an embrace or even a reassuring hand on the shoulder, dopamine and oxytocin rise together, creating a kind of reset signal for the nervous system. Studies show a rapid oxytocin response to meaningful touch, though researchers caution that measuring peripheral oxytocin is methodologically complex, so we describe the association rather than a simple one-to-one effect. Still, the finding is consistent. Moments of real connection shift the body's chemistry in ways that reduce stress and reinforce trust. You could think of oxytocin and dopamine as fertilizer in that inner garden, allowing resilience and a sense of safety to grow. Cortisol, in contrast, acts more like a creeping toxin. In limited amounts, it sharpens attention, but when chronically elevated, it corrodes memory, concentration, and mood. Intimacy deprivation alters this balance in subtle but measurable ways. Evidence in 2025 suggests that when opportunities for meaningful closeness decline, oxytocin release tends to be lower or less responsive after prolonged touch deprivation. That has consequences for feeling at ease with others. Oxytocin is linked with neural and behavioral patterns associated with trust and bonding in many studies. Touch can help trigger these systems, though the timing and measurement vary by study. Without regular activation, these pathways don't vanish, but they grow less efficient. Participants in long-term studies who lacked access to touch or supportive closeness showed muted oxytocin responses when they later attempted ordinary social exchanges. The system functions, but sluggishly, much like roots absorbing water after seasons of drought. Layered on top of this is the daily environment of 2025. People spend unprecedented amounts of time sustaining relationships through digital platforms, scrolls, emojis, reactions. Yet surveys by the WHO and APA this year show loneliness at record levels, despite all this surface-level connection. The explanation lies in neurochemistry. Text interactions briefly lift dopamine, but they rarely deliver the tactile and sensory feedback that primes an oxytocin response. Digital signals light up for a few seconds, then fade, leaving the stress chemistry unbuffered. Simply put, the brain does not metabolize a heart emoji the same way it metabolizes genuine presence. Without enough replenishment, cortisol steadily fills the gaps. While it's a necessary chemical for short-term performance, chronic levels wear away at the hippocampus, impair memory formation, and cloud decision-making in the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala, meanwhile, grows more reactive, scanning constantly for signs of threat. People caught in this cycle describe ordinary moments, conversations, work tasks, even leisure activities as inexplicably heavy. They aren't imagining the weight. They are experiencing the biochemical load of unbalanced stress hormones that never fully switch off. The paradox sits right here. Human physiology runs on intimacy in much the same way it runs on sleep or nutrition. Deprivation doesn't simply leave us feeling a little lonely. It recruits deeper neural circuits where scarcity rewrites default settings. The brain, deprived of consistent closeness, shifts from trust to conservation, limiting oxytocin release, padding defenses with cortisol, resisting vulnerability. The inner garden doesn't stop entirely, but growth slows, roots curl inward, expecting difficulty ahead. In this mode, even when small moments of connection appear, the brain sometimes struggles to trust them, fearing they won't last. Experimental findings underscore this adaptive but restrictive pattern. Adults who reported rarely receiving affectionate touch showed lower baseline oxytocin during trust-based tasks. Their bodies, meanwhile, carried higher stress signatures, including reduced heart rate variability, a mark of strain in the autonomic nervous system. Cortisol exposures weighed on attention and mood, making it easier to misinterpret neutral situations as hostile. Day to day, that means small conflicts feel magnified, simple demands sap energy, and pleasures fail to register with the same intensity they once carried. Without oxytocin's supportive tone, dopamine peaks flatten and reward feels muted. This is why even advanced digital wellness practices often fall short. Meditation can bring measurable calm, training people to breathe steadily and ease tension, but it does not directly prompt tactile networks that boost oxytocin. By contrast, a hug not only feels warm but activates pressure-sensitive receptors across the skin. Those receptors send signals through the vagus nerve, dampening cortisol release and stimulating emotional regulation pathways. Controlled trials confirm that touch reduces stress markers more quickly than guided relaxation. The gardener analogy fits here. Mindfulness might prune weeds, but only touch restores essential nutrients. The urgency grows sharper as people increasingly substitute digital interactions for embodied ones. On a screen, smiles and laughter look real, yet they cannot transmit the olfactory or tactile cues that humans have relied on for millennia to gauge safety and belonging. This missing layer strips the nervous system of its most powerful regulators. Without sufficient sensory feedback, cortisol expands unchecked, turning background worry into a steady undercurrent of stress. Over weeks and months, that shift accumulates into exhaustion, leaving the brain less adaptable and more prone to pessimistic judgment. Take an ordinary example. A friend likes your social media post. Your brain gets a small dopamine pulse, pleasant but fleeting. Seconds later, you're scrolling again. Contrast that with the grounding effect of a friend's hand on your back during a difficult conversation. The oxytocin release from that single gesture binds memory, quiets stress circuits, and sends the message that someone values you in real time. One lasts for a breath, the other imprints stability across your entire emotional system. In this sense, likes imitate care, but they do not function as replacements for it. The evidence all circles back to the same conclusion: intimacy is not decorative. It operates as a primary nutrient for human neurochemistry, hydration for the emotional soil. Without it, stress accumulates, memory erodes more easily, and optimism shrinks. Brains adapt to deprivation, but that adaptation comes at a cost. Resilience declines, and expectations of connection fall progressively lower. The absence of intimacy does not only create discomfort, it shapes structural function in the brain, normalizing survival strategies that prioritize self-protection over trust. What makes this cycle even more significant is the way scarcity sets new expectations. When the brain grows used to low intimacy, it prepares for loss before closeness even arrives. Cortisol keeps its grip, defensive postures harden. The shift is not a conscious decision but a physiological recalibration designed to minimize harm. Unfortunately, this kind of preparation reinforces exactly the outcomes it fears: hesitation, withdrawal, and a readiness to see rejection in neutral feedback. So the chemistry of connection is more than a story about hormones, it is a story about prediction. The brain adjusts chemistry in anticipation of what it thinks is likely to happen next. And when scarcity continues long enough, the nervous system begins to forecast rejection even before anyone actually turns away. This expectation becomes the next problem, one that shapes choices and rewrites behavior in ways that extend loneliness further. It's the moment where stress biology turns into self-fulfilling prophecy, and the brain, without realizing it, starts preparing for a no before you've even asked the question. When the brain starts expecting rejection, imagine opening a job application you've perfectly prepared, then hesitating before clicking submit because rejection already feels certain. That single choice might seem like low confidence, but patterns like this reveal something deeper. They show how the brain, especially when deprived of intimacy, begins to adjust expectations, scripting outcomes before reality has even happened. One of the clearest neural systems involved is the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. Neuroscience shows the ACC activates both when we experience physical pain and when we endure social rejection. That means exclusion, being ignored, or receiving cold responses doesn't just sting emotionally. It is processed through the same pathways as actual injury. The brain tags rejection as pain that deserves protection. Intimacy normally provides signals, eye contact, touch, laughter, that help regulate and calm this system. When closeness fades, the ACC operates more like a smoke alarm without pause. Small cues like a delayed text or a neutral pause in conversation can feel amplified into signs of danger. Each absence of feedback gets processed as rejection. Because those signals cause pain responses, the brain leans toward the safer choice, avoiding future attempts altogether. Over time, this avoidance grows into an automatic shortcut. The nervous system adapts by linking silence directly with pain, even before rejection truly occurs. Eventually, the idea of reaching out feels dangerous in itself. Like soil left untended, certain corners of the inner garden expect only weeds, so the effort to plant new growth barely begins. Intimacy isn't seen as unlikely, it's assumed to be impossible. Research in 2025 reinforces this cycle. Reports from organizations like the WHO, Harvard's longitudinal studies, and assessments by cognitive testing platforms such as Craving describe loneliness as predictive of social withdrawal. People who identify as chronically lonely aren't only struggling with disconnection, they're also less likely to start new relationships and more likely to retreat from potential ones. The paradox is clear: the people most in need of closeness engage less. The outcome is not a result of preference, but of rewired behavior that interprets connection as unsafe. This recurring expectation forms what can be thought of as neural pessimism. Once set in motion, the circuitry forecasts rejection even under neutral or ambiguous conditions. Like an overactive weather predictor calling for storms on clear days, the brain insists rejection is imminent. The impact reaches beyond protecting feelings. It restricts curiosity and narrows openness. Distractions or small slip-ups from others become exaggerated into proof of dismissal. When a friend cancels, the brain frames it as permanent. When a partner seems distracted, it sounds like abandonment. Facts play little role once neural pessimism dominates. The interpretation always bends toward loss. For those caught inside it, this feels like sabotage unfolding against their own intentions. People craving closeness find themselves skipping invitations, withholding messages, or declining to attend chances for connection. Outsiders can't see the obstacle and often mistake the quietness for indifference. But the real barrier is the brain's discouraging internal commentary. It whispers, "Don't try," because safety, in a narrow sense, is prioritized over potential fulfillment. That commentary often sounds familiar, as though it carries the tone of an old warning. Think of a relative who always reminds you not to get your hopes up, except now the advice comes from inside your own head. Deprived neural circuits echo that pattern, treating every attempt as a waste of energy. Each time action might be taken, the inner script delivers a resigned warning. Don't message them, they'll ignore you. Because these thoughts seem self-generated, they carry authority. They're harder to dismiss than external opinions. The trap deepens as deprivation adds multiple layers to isolation. The external environment may already hold fewer interactions, fewer gestures of closeness, but overlaid is the internal block, the hardwired tendency to avoid even when opportunities do appear. You think of inviting someone to lunch, but the imagined dismissal feels unbearable, so you stay silent. You picture reconnecting with an old friend, but your mind convinces you they've forgotten you, so there's no text. The cycle preserves distance under the pretext of defense, even while amplifying loneliness. This shift has visible effects on behavior. People moving under these conditions often pull back in subtle, observable ways, avoiding eye contact, staying quiet in conversation, or declining social risks. From the outside, this protective stance reads as aloof or uninterested. Internally, though, it's the nervous system guarding against anticipated injury. The paradox is brutal. The very behavior meant to prevent rejection ensures prolonged isolation. No one can step closer if those signals push them away. Understanding how the circuitry works doesn't erase the frustration, but it reframes loneliness as more than laziness or lack of effort. The ACC, built to detect and protect against harm, becomes oversensitive when touch and intimacy are scarce. Its protective rewiring removes the drive for risk-taking that new relationships require. Rather than nurturing potential growth, the system hardens against planting anything new. What the outside world interprets as quiet coldness is, inside, a tightly wound defense system repelling injury. Left unchecked, this internal defense doesn't remain contained to how one treats others. The discouraging voice grows sharper, folding back onto self-perception as well. Instead of merely expecting no from people outside, the inner script starts sculpting identity around rejection. Scarcity invites the brain not only to predict future pain from others, but also to decide unworthiness within the self. That shift deepens the drought's damage. Not only is the soil left barren, but the gardener begins to believe the soil was always too poor to grow anything at all. And that is where the pattern takes its heaviest toll. Once the inner dialogue reframes rejection as inherent to who you are, the drought no longer just shapes relationships, it reshapes identity itself. Next, how these changes alter the way you see yourself, and why the story echoing inside your mind is not only psychological, but deeply biological. The mirror gets distorted. When the brain begins absorbing rejection into self-identity, the mirror you use to see yourself starts to bend. This distortion isn't only about how others view you, it's about how your own internal systems narrate your worth. Scientists often trace this shift to the default mode network, or DMN. The DMN is the brain network most active during self-focused thought and memory recall, and studies show that prolonged social isolation is associated with increased rumination and DMN overactivity. In other words, when intimacy is scarce, the brain's natural narrator tends to recycle worries, amplifying doubt until criticism feels like the dominant truth. Consider how this plays out in daily life. If you message a friend and they don't reply for hours, a socially supported brain might label the pause as harmless, they're probably distracted or busy. But under the pressure of isolation, the DMN loop tells another story entirely. They're ignoring me, they don't like me. That voice doesn't wait for evidence, it fills the silence with threat. Or imagine replaying a conversation from the day. Instead of remembering it neutrally, the DMN highlights every tiny awkward pause, reinterpreting them as proof that you embarrassed yourself. These are two of the most common distortions, magnifying past interactions and misattributing the intentions of others. They're exaggerated, but they feel convincing because the DMN produces them automatically in the absence of social reassurance. Research updated in 2025 reinforces this link. On brain scans, socially isolated individuals consistently show greater DMN activity compared to those with richer interpersonal connections. Behaviorally, they report sharper self-criticism and an increased tendency to worry about imagined negative outcomes. Importantly, these shifts are not permanent. The data suggest probabilities, not fate. Prolonged isolation is associated with higher levels of rumination and distorted self-interpretation, but reconnection and intimacy can dial this activity back down. The garden hasn't been destroyed, it is simply malnourished. One measurable outcome of this overactive narrator is its connection to mental health. Elevated rumination tied to DMN hyperactivity is linked in research to higher rates of anxiety and depression symptoms. Put simply, when your brain repeats loops of self-criticism without external correction, it doesn't just sound unpleasant, it pushes stress chemistry, mood, and attention into darker states. Quick test: if your mind replays conversations at night and makes them worse each time, you are likely experiencing the DMN loop. Stick around, because later we'll cover practical steps for easing it. What makes this phenomenon especially tricky is how self-reinforcing it becomes. The more you expect disapproval, the more withdrawn your behavior grows. Withdraw and you receive less affirmation from others. The DMN then takes that silence and converts it into more negativity. Over time, the voice doesn't just analyze, it indicts. A small work error becomes evidence you're incompetent. A missed invitation feels like proof that you're unwanted. Without the balancing effect of social feedback, the DMN hands down verdicts on identity. This is where ambiguity, normally tolerable, turns toxic. A neutral pause in conversation or the simple quiet of an unanswered email becomes unbearable because the narrator assigns hostile meaning to it. In socially enriched contexts, ambiguity is gentle background noise. In isolation, it is recoded as accusation. The DMN doesn't leave ambiguity open, it closes the door with criticism. Now it's important to underline, these patterns are not moral failings or permanent scars. They are byproducts of a neural system running unbalanced. Just as cortisol surges in stress and eases once calm returns, DMN overactivity quiets once intimacy reappears. A single reassuring presence, a laugh, a hug, or a direct moment of acknowledgement shrinks its volume significantly. People describe the relief not as revelation, but as silence after noise, like a roommate finally leaving the room. Scientific evidence aligns with this everyday account. Controlled studies demonstrate that social contact and touch reduce DMN hyperactivity, restoring balance and reducing the weight of self-critical thoughts. What feels like character clarity is often just neural shift, a system being recalibrated by feedback it needed all along. This distinction matters. It reframes self-criticism not as personal truth, but as an error in the brain's prediction machinery. That reframing is essential because DMN distortions can escalate. If left unchecked, the line between "they dislike me" and "I am unlikable" blurs. The external interpretation folds inward as identity, and the mirror no longer reflects fairly. It's the weeds overtaking the image, not because the soil was flawed, but because nutrients ran dry. Without correction, this distortion layer deepens until ordinary life events feel like evidence of fundamental failure. From a practical perspective, recognizing the role of this system offers an anchor. Knowing that the DMN spins louder when deprived gives space to question its commentary. The content of the voice is not always evidence. It is sometimes just absence filling silence. That insight alone provides room to hold self-criticism more lightly, as a signal of deprivation rather than proof of unworthiness. Of course, distorted self-perception carries costs beyond internal narratives. Stress is one of the first systems to feel the spillover. When the DMN convinces you that every pause is rejection and every choice risky, the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, absorbs the shock. Lacking the balance that social reassurance normally offers, alarms trigger more easily and they run longer. This is why days feel heavier, decisions harder, and small setbacks more paralyzing when intimacy is missing. So intimacy deprivation doesn't just bend the mirror through which you see yourself. It lets an overactive inner narrator turn silence into accusation and small events into sweeping judgments. And once those distortions spill into your stress systems, the weight of ordinary problems grows, which leads to the next question: why does stress itself feel many times heavier when there's no one to call? Stress without a safety net. Stress without support feels heavier because the brain systems for regulating pressure depend on signals of safety from others. At the heart of this process is the amygdala, a small structure deep in the temporal lobe that serves as the alarm center. It constantly scans the environment for signs of threat, whether real or imagined, and activates the body's stress response when it senses danger. Heart rate rises, cortisol is released, attention narrows. This cascade works well when immediate action is needed, but without a reliable way to turn the alarm down, the body stays locked in high alert and responds as if every inconvenience were an impending crisis. Normally, intimacy provides that missing off switch. When someone offers presence through a touch, a calm voice, or even simple eye contact, the nervous system and the amygdala receive confirmation that things are safe. Research shows this works partly through oxytocin pathways that directly influence stress regulation. A moment of connection tells the alarm system it can rest. With these cues present, stress not only feels less overwhelming, it is physically reduced at the neural level. When social closeness is absent, this regulatory factor disappears. The amygdala fires more freely without the cues that calm it. Small events like a late bus or a delayed reply can ignite an exaggerated reaction. The stress system keeps burning unchecked. Problems don't necessarily get bigger, yet the brain amplifies them, stuck in emergency mode. This is why leaning on a friend after a difficult day often provides relief, even when the situation hasn't changed. The amygdala quiets once comfort is received, showing how vital relational buffering is to resilience. Recent evidence reported in 2025 demonstrates a strong link between loneliness and amygdala dysregulation. Brain scans reveal that individuals reporting persistent social isolation show heightened amygdala activity even during calm or neutral circumstances. Instead of toggling between arousal and rest, their systems stay activated, like an alarm that never switches off. This hyperactivity contributes to a state of constant low-grade fight or flight. Stress hormones circulate too often, decision-making suffers under pressure, and biological systems like cardiovascular regulation destabilize. Research shows chronic stress and loneliness are linked to persistent amygdala activation and changes in hippocampal volume, factors that explain why reactivity rises and memory problems emerge when isolation continues. The hippocampus sits near the amygdala and normally helps integrate memory with emotional regulation, but persistent stress exposes this region to high levels of cortisol. Over extended time, chronic stress can reduce hippocampal volume. Multiple imaging studies over the last decade found smaller hippocampal structures in people reporting years of social disconnection compared to their more supported peers. The 2025 findings strengthen this pattern. The practical outcome: memory weakens, details become harder to retain, and the hippocampus struggles to coordinate with the amygdala. This makes it more difficult to calm down once stress flares, and the brain loops longer in alarm states. To illustrate this in everyday terms, with intimacy, spilling coffee might be a minor frustration followed by a laugh. Without intimacy, the alarm misfires, signaling catastrophe instead. If hippocampal function is weakened by ongoing stress, calming that reaction becomes even harder. What should be a small nuisance ends up setting a mood for the entire day. The perspective isn't a personal flaw, it arises from worn regulatory systems. The analogy of a smoke detector helps capture this. A detector is designed to alert when true danger presents, but without proper regulation, it shrieks at harmless signals: steam, toast, or light smoke from a candle. The stress system under loneliness does the same. The amygdala trips at minor inconveniences, convinced they point to disaster. Living in that climate produces exhaustion. Every small challenge feels amplified into emergency status. It's not about thin skin, but about faulty calibration. Consequences ripple out. A missed text becomes intolerable. Feedback at work feels like threat. Coping resources dry up because recovery time shrinks. Resilience depends on a cycle, stress rising then de-escalating. Without close relationships, the second step doesn't happen as quickly, so the body spends hours locked in tension. Cortisol lingers into sleep, disrupting rest and mood regulation. Over weeks and months, fatigue piles up, eroding both concentration and emotional patience. Updated studies in 2025 give measurable weight to these observations. Survey participants with weak social ties reported not just more frequent stress, but more intense responses to minor triggers.